audience would like to introduce yourselves.
Or if they've got any questions at this stage, maybe we can just throw them out there while we've got some time, while we're waiting for the tech things to...
Yeah, and I think also if there's anything that you're hoping to take away from today, it could be cool to know, and then maybe we'll dive into that as we go.
Hello. Hello, Rachel. I just realised no one's going to be able to hear this on the stream. So you are Rachel, your pronouns are she, her, and you're an illustrator and a graphic designer, and you run a not-for-profit. I didn't catch quite what it was. Not-for-profit arts organisation called Fat Studio. Yeah. And I'm going to repeat, when you ask your question or whatever you're going to say, I'm going to repeat it back into the mic so that anyone who's watching the stream can hear.
As long as that's okay.
Otherwise, it's just silence for people.
Yeah.
So Rachel's saying that she puts on events and is hoping to expand upon them and try and help them be more ethical. I really paraphrase that massively. Sorry.
And more inclusive, envisaging, yeah. Amazing.
Oh, look, we've got some screen action going on. Fabulous. There's a question in the chat. Amazing. Hello to the people in the chat room. Hi, Jenny. Do you think safe space policies work? Oh.
Well, diving in before we get the presentation going. But by the way, you're not really that late. I've only just talked about what I do for like 5 minutes, so it's fine. So I'm going to go into this just a tiny bit. I guess a lot of people are thinking about not calling safe spaces
safer spaces.
People calling them safer spaces policies because to imply that you're completely safe is sort of
agree.
Yeah, can that ever be attained? I think it's almost like you need to have a safer space policy in place just as like the first step when you're putting on an event. So for those who don't know what a safer spaces policy is, often it will be in the description of your event or in posters around the venue, kind of outlining what's in place to make your event safe. That often they might say something along the lines of there's no tolerance of racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, etc. And like a mention of what you can do if you don't feel safe in a space, who you can talk to. I've been to some events where the promoters are at the venue wearing like fluorescent wristbands, for example, or something that points them out, where then it says that you can go speak to them if you are having any issues.
Well, that kind of almost answers the question I was going to pose. It's like, how do you stop that from becoming just lip service?
Yeah, exactly. So I think the first step is having that pasted on the wall or in your promotional materials, but that alone is not going to stop racism, homophobia, transphobia happening.
How do you put something into place where there is ramifications for that bad behaviour, or poor behaviour, I should say? Instead, if you've just got a sign on the wall, how does that actually effectively stop anyone from enacting those behaviours? Because a piece of paper generally doesn't.
Yeah, exactly. I think the piece of paper is more in place for those who need to sort of come forward and say something is wrong than actually putting off people from being in those spaces. Because I think a lot of the time people who are entering spaces and being discriminatory might not even think of themselves as discriminatory. So I think in order for these safer spaces policies to actually be implemented, you kind of need
there has to be something to back it up.
Yeah, you need to have a good kind of system of welfare in place. So a lot of events are having like welfare officers in place. There's a really cool organisation called Safe Only who are doing queer welfare at a lot of events where they're people who you can go and talk to for support, and they're actually trained up in it. They're not just they're not simply promoters who might not have the training. And then, you know, what is the reality when someone comes up to you and says, I'd like someone to leave the venue because they're abusive? It's actually really difficult to then be like, how do I ask this person to leave without there being an altercation? You kind of want those people to have that training.
Yeah, I think as well it's worth mentioning in the Good Night Out campaign, which go into venues and do train venue staff and venue security to empower the staff and security to be able to handle those situations. So that's another really amazing organisation that do that type of work. So really definitely worth shouting them out right now. And I think actually one of the other things in terms of promoters is if you do these kind of things, you have to get a buy-in from the venue. If the venue's got your back, then that helps a lot.
Yeah, I've definitely been involved in running events in the past where you may have a safer spaces policy in place, and then the security team who work at the venue actually take, you know, quite like almost violent approaches to security that are sort of counter the safer spaces policy. I think something else as well about safer spaces is it's not just about responding to something that is happening at the event when it happens, it's how can we actually prevent it in the first place. And in my mind, I think if we make events more accessible and actually have this kind of language around how do we make events inclusive, how do we stop these things happening in the first place?
Baking it in from the very start.
Exactly. It's like treating the cause rather than the symptom. Yeah.
Great question. Should we dive into a slide?
Diving into the slide. So I kind of, for this masterclass, I kind of want to go over accessibility in events from 3 different perspectives. We've got the people organising the events, the people who are artists and performers who are booked to be involved in the events, and you as an audience member. And for me, you know, putting on events and playing at events and attending events, I've done all 3. So yeah, you might not just relate to one. And I do think the responsibility, we were just chatting about this before, the responsibility can lie in a number of places. It can be the venue, it can be the promoter. And I think by putting these things in place, you're making there be less labour for people performing and attending your events.
Exactly, yeah. And it's like, you know, trying to figure out where the responsibility lies can be difficult, and I do think it's like a case-by-case basis for sure. And I think one of the other issues that we were talking about is in London, a lot of venues are not purpose-built. They're you're trying to shoehorn accessibility into an existing space, which can be really difficult, certainly with listed buildings as well. So again, it's like, how do we overcome these type of issues? And there's no easy answer sometimes. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, I know that it's very hard to be. You're almost lucky to find an affordable space to open a venue in London at this point, anyway. But I think it should be a priority for people to think, okay,
is this space right for what I want to do?
Yeah, exactly. If you agree to open a venue in a space that is not accessible, you are basically excluding a huge amount of people from coming to the venue. And I think it should be considered as much a priority as getting the bar built and getting the sound system.
And in terms of being a promoter, if you're putting on an event, you need to think about, does this venue fit my needs?
Yeah.
Not all venues will. So it's like, if you're trying to put an event in a space and you know that space isn't accessible and you're trying to sort of, yeah, I mean, I'm probably not articulating myself very well here.
No, but I have seen people put on events where they basically said, they have the awareness around accessibility, but then in the promotional materials around the event, they're saying, unfortunately, this venue is not accessible, and we hope to find an accessible venue in the future. So there's this awareness that they've actually decided to go for a venue that isn't accessible for everyone to come in the first place. And again, that might be because they were provided the venue for free, that there were other reasons it was good, but I think it's definitely like important to be thinking about these things as non-negotiable and supporting the venues that actually are built and designed to be more accessible, because there are a lot in London for sure. And yeah, I don't want to be too pessimistic in saying that like these places don't exist, because there's been some really great spaces opening that are like making changes recently. So I think where I'd like to start is kind of going through all the different access needs. Well, I say all, this is not an exhaustive list, this is just everything I could think of when I was putting my presentation together. But these are just some of the things that you might consider when planning an event, or I guess similarly setting up a venue. So maybe we can just kind of like go through each thing and think about why we need to think about these things. So starting out on lighting, I think often people kind of think that something that often comes to people's minds is obviously strobes, because strobe lighting, I mean, not only is it not safe if you have epilepsy, but it can also be, I find it very, very overstimulating, and I often have to just leave an event if there's strobes. But also I think it can encompass really bright, harsh lighting and really low lighting that is difficult if you have visual impairments.
We were talking about this earlier in terms of if it's really low lighting or like a black club and you're playing on equipment that you've never necessarily played on before, like, lots of different clubs have lots of different equipment. Like, for example, last weekend I played on CDJ 3000s and a Zone 96, and I'd never used a Zone 96 before, and they turned off all the lights and I was like, I can't see the mix and I've never used this before. Can you do one light on the mix? So it's again like talking to, as a performer, I had to then go and talk to the lighting people to get it changed so that I could literally see the equipment. And if I've got pretty poor eyesight, but obviously wear contact lenses, so so someone who doesn't necessarily have great eyesight, that's obviously a consideration, but like I was the one who had to go and talk to people about it.
Yeah, I've definitely been in the same situation, or similarly a situation where there's a bit of equipment that you haven't actually been told is the equipment that's being provided, and that can cause a lot of stress and anxiety and inaccessibility if there was a certain bit of equipment that you were promised and a different bit of equipment's there when you show up, and on top of that it's not lit clearly. It's going to like cause a lot of problems.
So again, this is something in terms of what we're talking about in terms of being a promoter or being a venue person. It's like providing the right technical rider in advance, making sure it's correct and how it reflects what actually will be there on the night or the day. Like considering the lighting needs of your performers as well.
Exactly, and I think, so I went to a party recently where there was basically a strobe going off all night. And I know. And yeah, I basically ended up just having to go outside because it was so overwhelming. And I think there's this feeling that like often venues want to be really dark or want to have strobes to create some kind of atmosphere, and I think maybe there's this fear around, if we don't include those things, how are we going to create some sense of immersion and atmosphere? And I think actually we can start to be a lot more creative about, okay, how do we have an immersive vibe that isn't also...
I know it's next on the list, but I want to add smoke machines to that list as well, because lots of venues will turn on the smoke machine to kind of create a vibe. And I think from working venue side for so long, I know for example, that actually smoke machines can really hinder the CCTV. So actually that also has an effect on crime as well. So I know it's not quite as exactly what we're talking about, but actually in terms of smoke machines, it's not always really helpful in terms of other things, in terms of it masking sexual assault as well, and it masking pickpocketing. So smoke machines are something that, you know, even though it's not really like accessible, but in terms of what we're talking about, it actually has other knock-on effects in other areas in terms of being a promoter too.
Absolutely. I mean, that's something I was thinking about with low lighting when you're in a club. I've definitely been at a lot of techno parties where it's so dark because they want the atmosphere to just be about hearing the music. But yeah, how are you supposed to implement a safer spaces policy when you're creating an environment where people think they can touch you because you can't see them, or no one gets to witness something that's happened? So, yeah, and then something on top with smoke machines is also that it's like a risk if you have asthma. I've been at an event with my partner who's
also
asthmatic.
not being able to see the equipment. Like,
Yeah.
we've all been in a DJ booth where they've turned the smoke machine on, going ham on it, and you're like, oh my god, I can't see the mixer anymore.
Exactly. And I mean, you know, I love what they do in principle, but I think the reality is they're really hard to. It's really hard to navigate a space when they're on. And yeah, how else can we create a sort of immersive atmosphere that doesn't rely on something that's going to impair people's sight and affect their senses? I went to an event with my partner who's asthmatic, and the smoke machine was going off and they had an asthma attack. And when we came out of the venue, the security said, oh, you can't be coming out. And we were like, well, they're having an asthma attack. And he said, oh, well, the only place else you can go is in the smoking area. So
Helpful.
Yeah. So, you know, I think it's also, it's something that we'll go into about having different areas that are less overstimulating and resting areas.
I just want to add to that, perhaps, and that's in terms of having, like, in terms of the staff training, you know, like maybe having like mental health first aiders on site, like trained mental health first aiders on site as well. And also, like, you know, making sure the security has this kind of training as well. So it's like if security had first aid training, they would probably know maybe the smoking area is not the best place for an asthma attack. So again, it's like, I think training is something that is just so important for staff to have. So maybe it's a question promoters can actually then ask the venue, what training does your staff have and what training does security have?
100%. 100%. Yeah, you've got it down. So kind of going off that, there's also having spaces not have like scent put into them and incense, which can also be, I think, particularly if you're neurodiverse, can be really overstimulating. And yeah, again, just thinking about how can we create a space that has this atmosphere that we're aiming for that isn't going to hinder people being able to come. So next, there's noise levels. So I've written on here is speech audible. So I guess that would be kind of relevant for an event like this. It might be less relevant for a night where there's, you know, just a DJ playing and no speech. And yeah, also having quiet spaces that aren't just smoking areas, like we were saying. And yeah, because I've definitely been to events where I've said, can I come outside? Because outside is the only place to sit down. And they say, well, you can't come outside unless if you're smoking.
I just want to do a shout out at this point now for a club in Newcastle called World Headquarters that I think last year they changed their green room into a welfare room. So they just got rid of their green room entirely and were like, right, we don't need this. The DJs don't need it. We're going to make a welfare room instead. And actually I DJ'd there when it was still the green room, and it was just like a room with a sofa, and now it's this really beautiful room. They've done it up, and if you are struggling and need a quiet space, they've got trained welfare staff inside the welfare room as well. So that's an example of a club space that's doing that in a really great way.
Love that. I wish I lived closer to Newcastle.
I highly recommend World Headquarters. It's a really good night out, and the security are really amazing as well.
Just plugging them there.
I think it's really good to like say when clubs are doing it right.
Absolutely. So kind of going off this idea of where do we go to sit down, this is definitely like, from my experience, this is one of my main access needs, is seating. And so something I've written down here are multiple comfortable seats available in a location that does not exclude the sitter from enjoyably experiencing the event.
So many venues are just like a black box with no seats as well.
Yeah, and even when there are seats, or even when I've contacted a promoter or venue in advance to ask for a seat, it's kind of, it's not always thought of, actually, the idea of where this seat is going. So, for example, I was going to a gig recently with my dad, actually, and I contacted the venue in advance saying, I can't stand up for long periods of time. Can you provide a seat at the gig? Because I didn't realise when I bought tickets that it was a standing-only gig. And they were like, yes, of course, we've reserved you 2 seats. And when we got there, actually, there was maybe like 6 or 7 other people who had reserved seats as well. But what they'd done is they'd lined up the chairs at the very back next to the sound desk with the entire standing crowd in front. So those who were able to stand up would intermittently stand up for 20, 30 seconds to try and actually see the stage and then have to sit down again, which basically just made us feel like, okay, so because
An afterthought.
Exactly, that we can't experience the event properly because, you know, they think that they've met the access needs by putting the seat in place, but then what does it mean? It actually means nothing if the seat is kind of in the wrong place.
A question I was going to ask is, what about when, you know, as a punter, or someone attending an event, and you know, you contact the venue in advance, and they say, yeah, there's seats in the space, blah blah blah, and you get there, and actually you need to use the seat, and there's someone able-bodied sat in it that doesn't move, and how do you kind of, how would you approach that kind of situation? Especially considering lots of people in clubs are quite inebriated and will maybe argue back with you. That's a difficult situation for that person to be in, and it's like, I mean, there's no real answer here, is there? But like, it's a question certainly worth talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something I've experienced, trying to navigate non-disabled people who are, not sober. There's been instances where, you know, like a promoter will say, we can reserve you a seat for the night, but sometimes I wonder, what does that mean when there's very limited seating available at an event, and maybe I've reserved a seat, but what about other people who need to sit down who haven't reserved the seat?
Or someone just goes, oh, that reserve sign.
Yeah.
And chucks it in the bin.
For me personally, it's actually, you know, living with ME has basically meant that I've dramatically reduced the amount of events I go to that are focused around alcohol and, you know, whatever anyone else wants to do. Precisely for that reason, because it's just, it can be really hard to navigate spaces when, people are not sober. So that's a difficult one, and I think my thought would just be, ideally we have enough seating for everyone. Ideally we have seating in the main, you know, say it's a 2-room event, which is the ideal, at least 2 rooms. And, you know, you might have music or the main performance happening in 1 room. That should have seats in so that people who can't sit down can experience the performance or the music, and then having a separate quiet space where people can move out and rest and be in a quiet space. Rather than, because another thing I've experienced is being like, oh great, this venue has seats, but it means that I can't actually watch the music if I want to sit down.
I also think that next on your list is really relevant to talk about now as well, which is ground floor access, because I think it's really, really relevant to what we're talking about in terms of, you know, being able to enjoy the seating, and like, you know, if it's not ground floor and you've already walked however many steps, and then you need the seats as well. I think these are 2 interchangeable parts of your list that we need to talk about in conjunction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we were talking about how it feels like in London there's so few venues that aren't basement spaces, that, you know, I think a lot of people might respond to the idea of ground floor access being like, well, there's barely any venues in London to choose from, so we can't guarantee that it's going to be ground floor accessible. But I think matter of the fact is there are venues. There's loads of venues, and I think it's something that you can't just consider like an afterthought, because actually, you know, nightlife, clubbing, particularly for queer people, as someone who's queer, you know, they're supposed to be liberating spaces that almost started from this place of activism, and your activism actually doesn't really mean anything without disabled voices. Disabled people were at the forefront of the civil rights movement and achieving so many rights for us, and if you're not including those voices, it's kind of like you're lost.
Just like even like consulting them as well. So it's like if you're putting together as a promoter, if you're putting something like this together, are you speaking to disabled people about what you're including, or are you trying to speak for them?
Exactly. And yeah, I think there's a lot of people who, I mean, I don't want to make people feel like their efforts are just sort of not enough, but I think there's some people who may think that accessibility boils down to ground floor accessibility, which is a baseline. It's like an absolute bare minimum to have a venue be ground floor accessible. But if you actually consult disabled people, chronically ill people, neurodiverse people, we have so many things that we can share from our experiences that I think a lot of non-disabled people would never actually think of.
As someone that's worked in quite a few basement venues, it's definitely something that I've thought about a lot over the years. And I'm just saying this because obviously I just want to be really upfront about the fact I've worked in loads of basement venues, and actually it's led me to have a lot of conversations with my disabled friends about how I can improve upon things, which was within my power to improve on, and what I can improve on moving into other spaces as well.
Yeah, I almost feel like we're going to go into this a little bit later because I want to talk about access riders in a bit. But for me, I feel like a lot of what I've learnt around my own accessibility needs has unfortunately been being in situations where my accessibility needs aren't met. Because you almost think, I think when you live with these things every day, you kind of, it just feels normal to you. And then you go out into public space and think, oh, I didn't really realise that wanting and needing to sit down is sort of such a strange request.
I also think carers and companions, which is the next thing on your list, is something that perhaps neurotypical and able-bodied people wouldn't even occur to them to ask performers about.
Yeah, so it's something that I've definitely seen support around in sort of larger, more corporate kind of venues, where you can have like a carer or companion ticket for free if you have access needs. But it's not something that I've seen offered so much
in dance music.
Yeah, or like in places that aren't big institutions. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory, but there's a lot of people who can't come to events unless if they bring someone with them, and it's not fair to expect that to be charged extra for. So if you are planning an event, I think it's something really good to consider. That, you know, and in the same way that there's an honesty system around sliding scale ticket prices, which has come on a really long way recently in terms of having different tier ticket prices depending on your income. I think similarly, you just trust that if someone asks for a free ticket for a carer or companion, that they're telling the truth and they need that person there.
Also, in terms of like seated events, you know, if you think about accessible seating, you've got to think about accessible seating for some able-bodied people who are going to be carers and would need to sit with their, like not just these accessible seats are only for people who have accessibility needs.
Yeah, exactly. That was my experience, for example, when I went to this gig with my dad that I was talking about, because my dad's not disabled, but obviously he wanted to sit with me because we were having this evening out together, and you know, he was my companion for the night, so he needed a seat too. So yeah.
Shall we look at the next one? So we've got food and travel.
Food is my favourite one. I will talk about this a lot. Even before I started living with Emmy, I just wondered, why don't venues have food, I had this amazing experience DJing in Berlin where halfway through the night, someone came out with a tray of sandwiches and you could get your sandwiches. And I was just like, yes, like, why?
Or like having ice cream at Berghain.
Yeah, why not? Like, I want my sandwich and I want to eat it. I want it all. I want my cake and I'll eat it too. Never get that phrase. What is that about? I mean, why aren't we eating our cake? But yeah, I mean, not only...
It's not gluten-free.
Make sure there's different vegan, gluten-free options provided. So yeah, I mean, not only access to food at venues. I had a great time at a venue a few weeks ago that served pot noodles on the dance floor. This is my first time out in ages, and I kind of did think pot noodle
That sounds so messy.
is that accessible on the dance floor? It's like quite hot and liquidy, but it's also exactly what you want. Yeah. Because you know, a packet of crisps, that's not enough if you're out for quite a few hours.
Sorry, I'm having a moment about these pot noodles. Like a balloon drop with pot noodles. No, oh my god.
That is why you need seating in the venue, so people can get their pot noodle, sit and eat the pot noodle before returning to the dance floor and spilling boiling water on other people. So yeah, having access to food at venues. I mean, I remember going to do a DJ set once and I had a cereal bar and a banana in my bag as the DJ, and the security were like, you can't bring this in. And I was like, I need it. I have accessibility needs. Like, I need to have sugar because my sugar levels drop a lot. And they had to, you know, go ask the promoter and da-da-da. And I think,
in lots of bigger clubs, there's often like fruit and, you know, snacks in the green room, but that's then only for the DJs, and you never really see that in DIY spaces.
I love a DIY event that does a big meal before the event starts. There's one of my favourite parties that I first went to when I moved to London 10 years ago, would have just like a huge feast at the beginning at like 9 p.m, which feels so late to me now. I would I'd be like, where's my dinner at 6 p.m? But yeah, like, it's something that we'll go into shortly as well. But, you know, why can't your event start a bit earlier and actually, like, feed sustenance to people in addition to snacks throughout the night?
Yeah, I mean, just someone coming around with a bit of fruit is actually, like, you know, however inebriated you are, actually, like, someone handing you a banana on the dance floor is quite nice.
Yeah, I mean...
Or strawberries. Sorry, I'm getting into it now, but yes.
Yeah,
fruit's actually quite a nice thing, I think, because you got that sugar and it's like, yeah.
Yeah, this masterclass is turning into our dream menu for an accessible event. But my earliest experiences with nightlife were when my sister used to take me to these psytrance raves when I was 16. And actually, I think those spaces... there's like a lot of white people with dreads. There's a lot of like a certain vibe that it's not the kind of music and aesthetic I would go for now. But the one thing they did get really right was they'd have dance floor in one half of the venue, and the other half of the venue would be the chill out space. There'd be a stall with chai tea and watermelon slices.
Bring back chill out spaces.
Yeah, there were like curtains, like net curtains hanging down, projections, like bean bags everywhere.
I would just like to say this is something that I am seeing coming back into nightlife, creeping back into nightlife a little bit. Like there's Club Cosmos happening in Leeds on a Sunday, which I think is like doing really interesting stuff with chill out. But yeah, this is certainly conversations that I'm seeing happen, like chill out spaces and room 2 chill out spaces is definitely conversations I'm seeing happen a lot more. So that does seem to be something that's inching its way back into nightlife.
My only thought on that as well is that when you often have dedicated events that are kind of these day events done in that vein, I think it's being aware as an event organizer, oh my God, as an event organizer, is your daytime chill out event for the people who haven't been to sleep the night before to kind of come down? Or is it for people to get day drunk? Or is it actually an accessible daytime event? Because the former still wouldn't be accessible to me because there would be very inebriated
How
people.
would you do it so that it would be for all three groups of people, or is that not doable in your opinion?
I think it might be like part of the marketing. Maybe it's also sometimes it's about the timing. I suppose when it's like an after party chill out event, sometimes these events will actually start like really early in the morning, so people go straight from the club to that. Maybe less so in London and more in Berlin, I guess. And then I think, like, I've been very excited when I've seen these daytime festivals happening in London, and then the reality is it's really, really focused around alcohol. And again, these are the same events where food isn't always accessible, where seating areas, unless if they're a smoking area, aren't accessible. So it all kind of ties together, where it's like, if your daytime event is in a venue where there's no food and no seating, then it's saying to people, you're at a daytime event where you're going to keep dancing all day. And I think in their mind, it's people who aren't going to be sober who are going to be there.
I just realised that we're basically talking about the timings, so we've actually skipped out travel. Do you want to? Should we just talk about travel really quickly, because we started talking about timings quite naturally. So we just go back and talk about travel a little bit.
Yeah. Will we jump back to timings? Because there's a few more points I want to make.
Okay.
While we're talking about timings, sorry, it's like everything blends together. So it's, yeah, there's no order to this. The order is fluid. So with timings, my experience, and I think people who are living with all sorts of disabilities and access needs, timings is a really big one of, does the start and end time exclude participants? So I basically can't really go to an event that starts at like 10, 11 p.m. anymore. The kind of event that I can go to would start significantly earlier, because staying up all night is not possible for me. So yeah, I think thinking about, maybe you do want to run like a nighttime event, a clubbing event, but then how could you include more people by starting it earlier on? It's just one example, but you know, I don't want to reduce everything to just clubbing either, because there's also lots of other types of music events. But yeah, we basically did talk about it. But with what I wanted to achieve with Desire Lines, I wanted to create a daytime event that actually had so many fun things going on, you wouldn't even think about wanting to be drunk. And so I think thinking about what is happening at your event that isn't actually just centered around dancing, because I mean, I loved dancing when I was able to dance, but it's sort of, yeah, how can you create an event that's centered around music that doesn't only provide one option of one thing to do that often people feel the need to not be sober for? So that is why I love events that have like different things going on, talks and workshops and sound baths and I don't know, whatever you want your event to include. So going back to travel,
yeah,
which we were going to talk about. So one thing is the distance of the venue from a station or bus stop, and also including that information in your event description. Yeah, exactly. Is there somewhere to park? Are there parking options for people who need to come by car? You know, not a few places are going to have a private car park, but just explaining where the nearest parking is.
And maybe even within that, parking charges, just so you kind of have an idea of, like, 'cause generally people who have accessibility needs maybe aren't always the wealthiest people. So explaining in advance parking charges could be really handy, so people can budget in advance as well.
Definitely. And something else that I've seen people, there's a really great organisation, and their name slips my mind at the moment, but they're basically a charity that helps fund people getting taxis home from events. I think it's actually more aimed at the trans community, but I would love to see events do this more in terms of disabled access.
I think actually one thing I'd like to say is perhaps promoters should budget for getting all of their performers taxis home, especially because that's like a safety accessibility need as well, in terms of, we're going back to talking about safer spaces. It's like if your performer is having to walk home afterwards, maybe that is a safety and access need. So like just something promoters should be budgeting in and baking in from the start is ensuring their performers get home safe.
And actually, something, I'm just going to skip to this last slide really quickly. So something I found out about recently is the Access to Work grant, which I wish I'd known about sooner, but it's basically, it's like a government grant that you can apply to get support in order to access work. So you as a performer, if you applied for the Access to Work grant, then one thing that they could fund is for you to get taxis to your place of work whenever you need, which wish I'd known about that before I was funding my own taxis and being really skint, or just having to stay at home because I couldn't afford it.
I mean, yeah, certainly as a performer that does eat into your fee when you know you want to get home safely and the promoter isn't providing money to get you home safely, and then that's you're already earning less because you've got your own access needs.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
Just conscious of the time as well, and this is quite a long list.
Yeah, so just other things that I've included. BSL interpretation, so that might not just be done for an event like this where we're doing a talk, but I went to a gig recently that had a BSL interpreter, and it was amazing, like, to have the lyrics. Yeah,
that's great. I've seen that on TV quite a bit as well. And I think the next one on the list, subtitles and captioning, certainly that is something we'll be doing for all of our videos, including this one, whereas when we upload them to YouTube, we'll be providing transcripts and subtitles on all of our content as well. So just so this will literally be subtitled.
Yeah, and I think sometimes I've heard from people that BSL interpretation and subtitles and captioning can be used interchangeably, which actually doesn't consider the fact that there are people who might be hard of hearing that don't know BSL and would like subtitles provided. I was talking to a friend about this recently who's partially deaf. So I think it's important to actually have both. And then this one ties into seating quite a lot. It's one of my own access needs, which is queuing. I think it's something that, in terms of my own needs, I've forgotten loads of times. I sort of would get to an event and then be like, oh, I have to stand in a queue for ages, but I can't. And then you can end up in these really stressful scenarios where, again, the security might be like, well, you're just trying to jump the queue. So it's like, how can we brief the security?
Training.
Yeah. Exactly. And also, not leave it on the people who are attending your event to contact in advance.
The onus shouldn't be on the person with the access needs.
Yeah.
And it always seems to be.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think people are scared of something like saying, like, if you can't stand in a queue for a long period of time, speak to one of us and we'll give you a fast track, because they're like, well, everyone's going to abuse that. But I think it's better to just think about people who need the access rather than those who are going to abuse the policy.
Welfare and safety we've kind of covered a little bit in terms of welfare officers and, like mental health first aiders, visible safe space policies. So let's talk about COVID.
Yeah, so this is something people just aren't thinking about anymore, but I mean, I feel like I'm the only person on every tube carriage who still wears a mask. But yeah, I think testing in advance, masks, ventilation, and even something as simple as on your promotional copy, just discouraging attendees from attending if they have symptoms. And I don't think this actually only just goes to COVID, because the amount of times that I have been at an event and someone's come up to me and gone, oh, I'm coming down with this awful like cold flu thing.
Why are you near me then?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like catching flu is what triggered my ME in the first place. So it's like, it's this mindset of like, oh, I really wanted to come, so I'm going to come when I'm sick, but not really thinking about how that might make other people sick. And that doesn't need to be limited to COVID, to be honest.
Well, I think like certainly for me as a performer, I do try and test. I do still test regularly, especially when if I've got loads of gigs coming up. Because at the end of the day, I'm going to be in a poorly ventilated room with lots of people.
Underline that. So the last thing, which we've covered a little bit, is just promotional materials.
So I'm really glad you put legible fonts and colours in and simple to read text, because the amount of posters, like the design of it at the moment, you're like, what does that even say? Or the colours are like this too similar, and you're like, I just cannot read this.
I know.
And I'm not. I don't have those access needs, and even I am struggling.
Yeah, I mean, it's well done on these people for like making cool pieces of art, but they're supposed to be communicating to people an event so that they can come to the event. So think about what colours you have on what colours. Is the text simple to read? And also maybe the event description, how simple is it for someone?
Well, alt text as well is something that not enough people are using, especially on places like Twitter and Instagram as well. So alt text is probably like something that lots more people should be using.
Yeah, and for anyone who doesn't know what alt text is, it's basically a description describing what is in the image that you've shared. So yeah, and then yeah, on top of that, having the text and information you're sharing actually be easy to take in. For example, if you're dyslexic, it can be really complicated to just read a massive chunk of paragraph. And yeah, then something just as simple as actually including the accessibility info for your event in the event description, rather than leaving it on people to have to contact, you know, some people might put, contact the venue for accessibility info, or like, feel free to reach out to us, which is great.
I think putting the onus again on the person with the access needs.
Yeah, and I think it is also very important to include contact details, because some people just might have questions, and it's always important to keep that dialogue open, but both is good. So just finishing up from talking about planning events, does anyone have any questions? Yes. Yeah, that's a really good point. So I'm just going to repeat what they said, which is making payment. Now my mind's gone blank. I don't want to misquote you. Making payment accessible, not expecting people to perform for free, sliding scale tickets, and paying people in time, not expecting people to be paid, you know, a month or more later, which I've also, you know, some gigs I've paid and chased and never been paid, which is something I come up against a lot as a freelancer. And thinking about different kinds of payment as well, as an accessibility need. Some people might prefer cash and some people might prefer bank transfer. There's all sorts of conversations around this that you can have. Yeah, so that's a really important one to bring up. And that's actually something that in this next section where I'm going to talk about access riders, I hope we don't overrun too much here. But yeah, something that you might talk about if you are an artist putting together an access rider is costs. So that's skipping ahead a little bit, but I just kind of want to talk about what an access rider is. So it's a document that outlines your access needs. It's really, really helpful if you are disabled or neurodiverse or have any kind of access needs to put together. And it basically saves you writing out or explaining your needs every time you work, which is what I did for ages. And by trial and error, I learnt that I would leave a lot of things out by presuming things. So putting together an access rider can really help you consider situations and needs that you might not have thought of mentioning to an event organizer. So if you feel comfortable to, if someone contacts you to take part in an event, it is always helpful to mention your access rider, even just in passing in conversation to the event organizer sooner rather than later. even if you don't send the document itself straight away. I think particularly if your participation in a project is dependent on your access needs being met, then it just avoids putting loads of labour into getting involved in a conversation with someone only to find out that they can't meet your access needs at all.
Just like a million emails in one thread, and just trying to pick out like if you're doing it point by point, just having it in one really handy document instead of just like question after question after question. It helps both parties out.
Yeah, which is, so something else I've actually also put in here is, well, actually, no, it's later on, it's not in this slide, but something really helpful when you're sending your access rider is actually to start a new email thread saying, this is my access rider, attaching it, and actually asking the person you're sending it to agree with it and say that they've read it, so that they're not just receiving it, not opening it, and then not actually putting anything in place. And then it doesn't get lost in the massive email thread.
Should we have a look at it now, do you think? I think that's worth, like, you know, you've put together like the kind of template one of the slides. Maybe it's worth just having a quick look at it now.
Yeah. So I've actually got a couple of examples of Access Rider templates. I didn't make them myself. This one is from the Musicians Union, and this document, this PowerPoint presentation, will be downloadable as a PDF afterwards, so you can click on the link at the bottom of this slide where you can download the Access Rider template. This is a really simple template that basically includes a section with an introduction, a section where you put your access needs, a section for emergency information, and then a final section for further information. I've got a second example, which is via Disability Arts Online, which is way more in depth. And on this slideshow, I've actually included 3 pages out of a lot of pages that's available in this template. And this one goes a lot more in depth in terms of it actually has some of the text written out already, and then areas that are written in grey, you can fill in your name and your access needs and the information you want to put in, which can help if writing isn't really something that comes naturally to you. And this one's split into really specific sections. So you've got one for travel, which includes general travel, travel outside of your local location, and international travel, which can really vary a lot. Accommodation. Then there's another section for meetings, rehearsal spaces, and quiet spaces, policy around photography and filming, and that goes on. And I'll go into the different sections that you might include in a moment. I've also included at the end of this presentation document a few links to different places where you can not only find Access Rider templates, but you can also see other people's access riders, which actually is even more helpful from my perspective of just seeing how someone else has approached it, and the things that they include. For example, like Joanna Hedver's access rider, who's a really, really amazing person who's done some really cool writing on disability. They've shared that access rider, and something that they included that I would have never thought of was that when they're booked flights for international travel, that they're not allowed to, they state that one of their access needs is that flights can't be before a certain time, because the amount of times where someone's booked the cheapest Ryanair flight for me to go out and do a performance that sets off at 8 in the morning, and then it's like, oh, I'm getting up at 3 a.m. to get to the airport. And if you're expected to do a performance or take part in a public-facing event on the same day, yeah, and that's another thing you might mention, rest days between travelling and events.
Also, like, in terms of booking flights, I think, you know, like, for certainly if you're not able-bodied wheelchair users or people who've got like extra things they need to bring with them, is taking that into consideration, especially as those can often get damaged in the airport when you're not with your piece of equipment that you need. Definitely. And, you know, this might be something else where the Access to Work grant can come into play, where, you know... Or if you're a promoter, like, and someone you've booked from abroad has has their wheelchair damaged at the airport, what can you do as the promoter to help your performer out because they now don't have a wheelchair?
Yeah,
Things like
I've
that,
heard of this
things like that is
happening
just
as well.
worth bearing in mind. I think just I've heard loads of horror stories.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I don't want to be like everyone get the access to work grant because, like, I haven't got experience with applying for it. But in theory, you know, a lot of promoters.
Do you know someone who has had experience in applying for it?
I do. Yeah. And all of their travel costs to access work are covered. So, you know, that means a DIY promoter who wants to book you that can't actually afford to book the more expensive later flight or the flight with extra legroom, you know, that those costs can be covered. So I'm just going to jump back to... Yeah. So I'm going to go through this a little bit faster because I realise I've been going on lots of tangents. But with an access rider, so basically, you don't need to actually go into explaining your condition or justifying your needs or sharing anything private, only if you want to, of course, to give context. But for example, if you say, oh, I need access to a toilet at all times, you don't need to say, because I have IBS, you can just say, I need this access. So when you're putting together an access rider, something that I spoke about earlier is, so what are the things you consider when putting it together? I think when I did this, it was actually really illuminating to be like, I'm actually going to sit down and think about all the things I need. And a place that can be helpful to start is actually what issues have arisen in the past for me around access. So one example, which I've put a little bit later on, is be specific. So for me, when I was DJing a lot more, I haven't done it in a while because I've just decided it's not accessible for me in the current way that most events are run. But I would ask to have a chair in the DJ booth so I could sit down whilst DJing, not thinking that I would show up and find a chair that's like really low next to DJ decks that are for someone standing up and being like, well, I can't sit down and control.
This comes back again to your anecdote about going to see the gig with your dad, where they were like, oh, there's some chairs there, we've done it, tick.
Exactly. So, you know.
The practicality of it. So I think in terms of what you're saying, it's like promoters need to test what accessible things they're putting in place. Like if you're putting a chair in place, is this chair practical for the need it's trying to meet? So test it.
Exactly, because bringing the chair in, actually, it just doesn't make any difference otherwise. So an example of how you could be specific is writing, a cushioned chair with a back must be provided in the DJ booth. The chair must be a height where it is possible to reach all the controls of the CDJ whilst sitting down. So in your access rider, you might have different needs for different situations. For example, in IRL events, online events, overnight trips. So it's important you can break it down into different steps. Something that you need on an overnight trip, like accommodation, isn't going to be necessary if you're doing a Zoom talk. And then coming off that, if you work in multiple mediums, consider different sections for different types of work. So performances, exhibitions, talks, meetings. For example, if you're doing a performance or exhibition, you might say that you can't lift heavy objects and you need assistance with that. With a meeting, you might say, oh, I can't spend more than an hour on Zoom or I start to get really fatigued. And just by saying that in advance, the people who are holding the meeting come in with an understanding that the conversation can't be dragged out.
As someone who does wear multiple hats, would you not have different documents that you would send out, or would you have one with all of it on?
Again, it depends, because for me, some of my practices really cross over and then others don't. So like for my photography, for example, that would generally feel quite separate, but there's been times where I might exhibit sound works in an exhibition, which then has this kind of similar approach to putting together photography exhibitions. So there might be things you can take from the other. It totally depends on your practice and how separate these things are, but absolutely you could have separate
So it's questions
riders.
that you're asking yourself, going back to that first point, isn't it? Like asking the questions of yourself first.
Exactly. Something else is, are any of your needs negotiable? For example, for me, it might be a taxi is not required from the venue to the hotel if the journey is under a 5-minute walk. And then consider your needs for different stages of the project. So that could include pre-production meetings and conversations, travel, accommodation, setting up, and the performance or public-facing event
like
itself.
sound check, are they providing travel to and from the sound check? Like if you're doing sound check at, say, 6 p.m. but you're not performing till 11 p.m., are they providing you providing you taxis back to the hotel, back and forth? Like taking those kind of things into consideration and consideration for budget as well.
Absolutely, and timings, because the timings of that can be really inaccessible. So something else you might include is emergency information. So that might be emergency contact numbers that the person who's receiving the access rider have to hand. Also any information around medication, or what someone might do if a certain scenario happens. You might say, if I start acting like this, leave me alone, don't touch me, don't call emergency services, and you can have that written down in advance so they know what to do. This is optional, but some people might include supporting information and links if they help to clarify your needs. So for example, one that comes up a lot around ME and chronic fatigue syndrome is spoon theory, which a lot of non-disabled people don't know about.
Do you want to explain? I mean, I know what spoon theory is, but do you want to give a really brief explanation? Because I think it's a really good analogy.
So it's basically this idea that you... I hope I explain this not really confusingly, but you have a certain number of spoons that you can use each day, and each activity that you do that exerts a certain amount of energy, you use up a spoon. And once you've used up that number of spoons, your energy is at 0. You've run out of battery. And things like having rest space and time in between can help you recharge that spoon. So another analogy I make often is that my energy works a lot like a phone with a really bad battery that needs recharging loads of times over the day. And so in addition to supporting information, you might want to just include a sentence that mentions whether you're comfortable with the document being shared within the organisation.
Yeah, I think the confidentiality is something really interesting, because I don't necessarily think many venues would think twice about it. Do you know what I mean? They'd be like, oh yeah, let's just share this. It's a resource, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, and I think I've had to deal with a lot of my sort of shame over time of like, I've been quite vocal around my access needs in terms of the music industry, but in terms of my photography practice, I really have been quite quiet about it. I think because even more than the music industry, it feels really hard being a freelance photographer with access needs where that's a whole other conversation. But, I wouldn't really want my music related rider to be shared with like photography clients or something. And so we mentioned this earlier, but sending your document in a new email thread so it doesn't get lost, and asking for confirmation that it's been read and agreed with. Some people might even have a section that actually needs to be signed.
I think quite often it's easy when venues are dealing with loads and loads and loads of emails, and you're dealing with a really huge email thread. Actually, it's really helpful for the venue to be able to pull that information out very easily and search for it really easily. And, asking for confirmation means that they have to then think, okay, no, I have received that. Because it's all too often for things to slip through the cracks. For venue to go, oh, I didn't get it. And then they search the email, be like, oh my God, it was lost in that 60 email thread.
Absolutely. And
having been in that exact situation on venue side. Not that exact situation, but I mean in terms of losing information really easily. And I just want to point out that it's not always a venue being rubbish or not caring about you. It's just the thousands and thousands of emails they're dealing with millions of promoters and millions of performers. Over the course of however long, it's so easy for stuff to get lost. So actually just taking that into consideration and putting it in a separate email thread is really, really key. Like, just giving them a little bit of a hand in terms of that is just like helpful, because it helps you.
Yeah, and even saying something in your access rider or in your email saying, if you can't meet my access needs, you need to give me this much notice before the event so that I can make alternative plans, which is something really helpful that I saw in Joanna Hedver, who I mentioned earlier, the links in the document. Their access rider says, if you can't meet my access needs, it's a conversation, feel free to talk to me and let me know at least 3 weeks before the event so I can put different measures in place. Don't let me know the day before when there's no time to organise anything. So just going through quickly the things that you might include in an access rider: your name and pronouns and contact information. And then you can sort of break it down into whatever sections that you want, but this is just a guide of some examples. So communication, whether you prefer email, phone, Zoom, in person, and if you need extra time to respond, because some people, you know, their baseline is expecting you to respond within a day or two, but it might actually be like a week for you. Documentation, if you need support around reading, writing, completing forms, making bookings and reservations, or maybe even funding. You can, like Arts Council England, for example, if you contact them, they will pay for you to have an access worker to help you apply for funding. And there's loads of needs just around filling in like intense documentation that needs support. Whether you need a carer or companion and their requirements and costs, and asking that the promoter pays for them. Accommodation, so location, checkout times, that's a really big one. The amount of times I have DJ'd, gotten back really late.
If you're playing till 4 a.m. and your checkout is at 10 a.m., then like what, you know, that's, yeah.
Yeah, when are we supposed to sleep? And yeah, whether the accommodation has ground floor or lift access. Catering, you might mention allergies, you might mention your need to access regular snacks and non-alcoholic options. The amount of times I've been in spaces where the only non-alcoholic option is basically water or like an energy drink, and I don't drink caffeine. And that's another one that just encourages people to create a space that isn't centered around alcohol. Travel arrangements. So, as I mentioned before, these can be separated into local, national, and international. So these could vary from parking needs to requirement for taxis to be ordered and paid for in advance. Public transport requests such as extra legroom, being near a toilet or in a quiet coach, or not having flights depart before or after a certain time of day, or not travelling on the same day as the event itself. Timings, rest breaks, and rest requirements and facilities.
I just want to add to that. One of the things that I've started doing is asking where the toilet is in relation to the DJ booth. And just knowing that in advance has been really helpful. So I think including things like that in, like how many steps is it from the DJ booth to the bathroom is like, you know, really, really key.
Thank you. Take care. Thank you. So yeah, we've also had some questions come in which we can reply to after online and put some resources together because I'm aware that we have run over by a lot. So the timings, rest breaks, and rest requirements facilities. You might, like you said, have a sound check and then a very long gap before you're actually performing, and maybe you're not even staying in accommodation. So where can you rest or even have a nap? What facilities can be provided for that? And what timings, you know, what time can you not work later than or before? How many hours in a day can you realistically do something before you have to go and rest? And then the sort of things that we've described a lot earlier on in this is venue requirements. So that's things like toilet access, ground floor and lift access, seating, sensory sensitivities, assistance with heavy lifting. That's almost like the things that you'd first think of, and all this other stuff is stuff that I didn't immediately think of actually saying until I started putting together an access rider. And how far in advance the venue must confirm having your access needs met so you can make alternative plans if needed. You can outline any costs related to your access needs and a term outlining that these need to be paid for, emergency information, supporting information and links if you wish, confidentiality. You might want to include a section for the organizer to sign, agreeing to meet your needs. And then, so these last things might be optional. Some people, I think, you know, it's up to your own discretion. You might be actually really afraid that if you put these things on, it's going to sort of limit your ability to get work. But if you feel like you're in a position to do this, I think it can be really amazing to state that you're not going to take part in an event that is not wheelchair
Or
accessible.
it's accepting that it will limit your options of work, and how okay are you with that? Because it will.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
It's not like it might limit your options of working. It will limit your options of working.
Yeah, and, you know, there was an example where I saw someone put this clause in their rider, but their career is at a certain point where they can probably afford to
say no.
Yeah. But if you feel like you can say you're not going to take part in an event that's not wheelchair accessible or does not make every effort to provide BSL interpreters or captions, etc., then it's a really important way of just showing solidarity, and that it's not just about your access needs, it's about the audience's access needs.
There's a very well-known trans DJ who I was told the other day has on their access rider that their artist liaison must be a trans person.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love that. I've definitely heard.
They are very, very famous, so it's something that they're able to put on their access rider, which I think is what you're saying is, like, when you're at that level, you can say these things and they will be done for you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, famous people request all sorts of, you know, Devil Wears Prada level requests about things that they need brought into town.
That's just quite a wholesome one, though, I think.
Well, exactly. I don't think that's diva-ish. Like, I have friends I have a friend who's a really famous trans artist and has been misgendered when they show up to do their performance.
So I think that's actually one of the reasons why I believe that they have it on the rider, is so that it's someone local who's trans who's working with them in that city. If you're travelling a lot, you want to know you're going to feel welcome in all the spaces that you're going to enter, and actually having someone who is trans from that area is going to be able to tell you that really honestly.
Yeah, and this is making me think of, there's a link that I've included at the end of this presentation to this blog post written by Mia Mingus, who's a really amazing disability thinker, activist, writer, who's written about this concept they've coined called access intimacy, which is the feeling of having your access needs actually understood and related to. Rather than it just being something where someone's like, okay, I'm trying to understand, but I don't, like, I'm imagining this world really far away from my own experiences. That idea of being like, someone just gets it and you don't need to explain yourself. So yeah, some artists might also state in a similar vein, this is a bit of an easier one for just people to implement, promoters to implement, is that all marketing materials that include their name must include accessibility information on them and have alt text. Some artists also might state whether or not they're comfortable being photographed with flash, and if any documentation of the event is published, that it has captions and image descriptions. So yeah, you can look at these resources in the document that...
We will certainly share them. They will be up, just...
Yeah, and, you know, I just also want to say, like, huge shout out to these
to the people that have created them.
The people that have created this that I've linked to.
Credit to the people that have put this together for all of us to share.
Yeah, I mean, one of the amazing ones that's at the top of this list is called Access Docs for Artists, that was put together by a group of disabled artists, and they've shared their own access riders as well as templates and information.
One of the other things I was going to say is that if you follow different disabled artists or trans artists or any LGBT artists, well, lots of these people will share their own access riders on their social media. So it's worth looking into what artists you admire that, you know, maybe are going to be requesting these type of access needs, and just following them, because this is stuff that does crop up a lot on social media.
Yeah, not everyone wants it to be confidential. It's up to your own discretion, really. Yeah. So I think that's Yeah. I'm sorry we had to rush through a bit in the end. And I also just want to quickly say that I'm aware that because of my own experiences as someone who's chronically ill with a certain kind of experience of disability, I'm aware that some of the language I've used might have focused more on disability than neurodiversity. And there's so many resources out there that cover the breadth of different experiences.
I think we kind of said at the beginning, though, this is, just like, no, there's no one size fits all. And obviously, we only really touched on safer spaces very, very briefly at the beginning. And obviously, that, that is something that is really important in terms of accessibility needs. So, that maybe that's something that we can expand upon afterwards.
Yeah, and I think it's also, there's loads of crossover actually between accessibility and inclusivity for neurodiverse and disabled people, and inclusivity in terms
because of intersectionality.
Exactly. So, if your event is accessible to disabled and neurodiverse people, it's probably also ticking a lot of inclusivity boxes.
A lot of LGBT people are maybe neurodiverse.
Yeah, and safer
or have accessibility needs.
And safer spaces policies, they serve to, not just support like a small group of people. It's really helpful in loads of different intersectional ways.
I think one of the things we were talking about before was in terms of being queer and, wanting to go to queer events that aren't accessible. And you're like, well, what queer events are there for me now? Come on, like. So yeah, like I think this in terms of this conversation, intersectionality is really important.
Yeah, and I think the LGBT community is definitely at the forefront of thinking about these things more. Activist spaces. I mean, I also am very involved in community gardening, and I volunteer at a garden.
Wholesome.
I've just become like this wholesome cottagecore child now. But I volunteer for a community garden that supports people who are recovering from mental health and disability. And there's a lot of things that just, in that space, like, are just thought of without question that in other spaces aren't thought about. And I'm not saying queer spaces are perfect either, and I'm not saying those spaces sometimes can have limitations.
Queer spaces are still subject to the exact same limitations that we've discussed in terms of cishet spaces or mainstream spaces. Some of them are still being shoehorned into existing spaces that aren't necessarily accessible. Some of them are accessible. It's all this, it's all the same in terms of the logistical limitations, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. But, there's no liberation for some of us without liberation for all of us. Exactly.
Do we have any more questions in the chat room at all? No? Okay. Well, I think that might be it. God, we've talked about a lot of stuff.
Do you have any questions? Audience?
Okay, I think we literally covered everything that we could possibly cover in the time that we've had available. So thank you very much to everyone that tuned in. A big round of applause for the wonderful El Hardwick. Woo!
Thank you.
We will be uploading everything with all of the resources, and please just drop us any questions if you have anything further.
Yeah, one of our lovely audience members actually left some written down questions before they had to leave. So that's something that maybe we can reply to online.
Yeah, for sure. We can certainly put that up, and we can put any documents up, and we will put them on our Google Drive with links so that you can access all of this stuff. Thank you so much to everyone.
Thanks for having me.